On a silent Christmas night, when the world was wrapped in snow and most families were gathered in warmth, one police officer drove alone into the heart of a rising blizzard. What she discovered in the frozen forest would pull a forgotten rescue dog back into duty, awaken a broken man from years of grief, and change a quiet mountain town forever. This is not just a story about danger in the snow. This is a story about faith, loyalty, and the kind of miracles that arrive when all hope seems lost. Before the story begins, tell us where you are watching from in the comments. Your voice matters here. And if stories of courage and second chances still touch your heart, please press subscribe to support our YouTube channel and walk this journey with us. Snow began falling over Pine Hollow long before night fully arrived, quiet at first like scattered feathers, then thicker, heavier, until the entire small mountain town seemed wrapped inside a white dream that muted sound and softened light. Pine Hollow was the kind of place where Christmas decorations stayed up longer than the snow itself, where street lamps glowed like warm moons above narrow roads, and where most people still believed winter should be faced together, not alone. Claire Morgan was the last person who believed that anymore. At 32, she carried herself with the rigid control of someone who had rebuilt her life from fragments and never fully trusted the structure again. She was tall and lean with squared shoulders, pale skin shaped by years of night shifts and mountain cold. Dark brown hair pulled into a regulation bun that never loosened, sharp gray eyes that observed more than they revealed, and a quiet beauty that came not from softness, but from endurance. 3 years earlier, her husband Daniel, also a police officer, had been killed during a pursuit on an icy highway beyond town limits. A crash so sudden the snow had barely had time to cover the wreckage before her life split cleanly in two. Since that night, Claire had withdrawn from dinners, laughter, and future plans as if they were optional risks she no longer wished to take. With the people of Pine Hollow, she was respected, even admired, but she remained distant, polite without warmth, helpful without intimacy, the officer who never lingered after a call, the woman who always chose night shifts during holidays. On December 24th, she drove alone through snow-choked streets while most windows glowed with wreath light and family movement, her patrol car cutting a narrow, steady path through a town that smelled faintly of pine, wood smoke, and baked sugar drifting from hidden kitchens. Inside the station earlier that evening, dispatcher Sarah Whitman had tried once more to soften the edge that grief had sharpened. Sarah was 42, round-faced with expressive brown eyes and dark curls usually escaping her headset, a woman built for warmth rather than authority, who brought homemade soup to officers on long shifts and remembered the birthdays of everyone who pretended not to care. "You don't have to take the overnight," she had said gently, her voice careful, knowing pressure would only make Claire retreat further. Claire had met her kindness with the same faint, unreadable smile she used on everyone, the one that ended conversations without confrontation. "Someone has to," she replied. And so, she was here now, the final active unit in Pine Hollow as the storm thickened and the radio filled with overlapping warnings of black ice, downed lines, and deteriorating visibility. The town itself seemed to be holding its breath, surrendering to weather older than its streets and roofs, while Claire moved forward with the silent discipline of someone who knew that motion was the only thing that kept memory from catching up. Her patrol vehicle's thermal detection system flickered occasionally along the roadside, registering animals sheltering beneath trees, the ghostly warmth of deer shifting in distant brush, the fading outline of a stray cat darting between buildings, until a sudden, unnatural heat signature flared near the forest boundary beyond the last row of houses, sharp and isolated, pulsing faintly like a wounded heartbeat in the snow. Claire slowed instinctively, hands firm on the wheel, posture tightening as training took over, where emotion no longer reached. Her instincts had never failed her before, and she trusted them more than she trusted people. She keyed her radio to inform dispatch, but the storm swallowed her signal in hissing interference, static rising and falling like breath trapped inside glass. Protocol told her to retreat. The call had already gone out for all remaining units to return as conditions worsened. But another part of her, the part that once chose law enforcement because it meant standing between danger and strangers, would not allow her to turn away from an unanswered signal. She drove forward alone, tires crunching over snow that had already begun to harden into slick white armor, the town lights shrinking behind her as the forest opened ahead like a blackened cathedral of branches. The trees stood tall and skeletal, their limbs heavy with snow, the wind threading through them in low, mournful tones that sounded almost like distant voices. Visibility dropped so quickly she could barely see beyond the hood of her car, but the thermal outline grew sharper with every slow, deliberate movement forward. When she reached the faint shape of a pickup truck, angled awkwardly between trees, its lights dim behind crusted ice, her first thought was accident, the kind winter delivered without warning or mercy. She parked at a cautious distance, stepped out into thigh-deep snow, and the cold struck her instantly through uniform and bone, stealing breath and sharpening focus at the same time. "Police!" she called into the storm, her voice nearly vanishing under the wind. No answer came, only the groaning of branches under accumulating weight. As she drew closer, her boot struck something metallic beneath the snow, a length of chain, too new, too deliberate to belong to a simple roadside mishap, and that was the moment the forest answered her presence. Hands seized her from behind with brutal speed, one arm locking across her chest, another twisting her weapon away before she could fully react. The attackers moved with the practiced coordination of men accustomed to operating outside the law, their faces obscured by scarves and hoods, their bodies broad and powerful beneath layered winter gear. One of them struck her hard behind the knee, dropping her into the snow with numbing force, while the other bound her wrists with zip ties that cut into her skin like frozen wire. Claire fought with everything she had left in that instant, elbows, knees, teeth, but the cold and surprise worked against her, and the men were desperate in a way that made pain irrelevant. The first attacker, a tall man with a scar visible beneath the edge of his hood and eyes too cold for the weather to claim as its own, hissed that she should have stayed in town, his breath fogging in furious bursts. The second, broader and heavier, reeked faintly of fuel and cigarette smoke, his movements hurried and clumsy with panic rather than control. They dragged her across the snow like unwanted cargo, boots slipping as the storm thickened around them, then forced her into the sealed rear compartment of the pickup truck, a dark metal space that smelled of oil, damp canvas, and fear that had no clear owner. The door slammed shut with finality that vibrated through her ribcage, and for a heartbeat, the world went completely black. Inside the compartment, the air was bitter and thin, her breath echoing fast and shallow against metal walls that offered no warmth and no answer. The truck jolted as the engine roared to life again, tires spinning before gripping the snow and launching them deeper into the forest as the storm closed behind like a drawn curtain. Bound at the wrists and pinned in darkness, Claire pressed her forehead against the freezing steel and forced her breathing into steady count, despite the rising panic that clawed at her throat. Images of Daniel flickered uninvited through her mind, of headlights on ice, of a life ending between heartbeats, and for the first time in 3 years, the wall she had built to contain grief fractured enough to let fear pass through. Outside, the storm erased their tracks almost as quickly as the truck carved them, snow swallowing sound and distance alike. And Pine Hollow, with its glowing windows and waiting people, faded into a memory that felt suddenly fragile, far away, and uncertain. The storm had erased the world into moving white walls, turning roads into memory and forests into breathing shadows. Yet the German shepherd still moved with quiet precision through the chaos, as if the snow itself remembered its shape and parted just enough to let it pass. He was no longer young, though not yet old. Perhaps 6 winters had carved lines into the strength of his body, his broad chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, despite the cold that bit even through his thick double coat. His fur was once a proud sable black, but now streaked with dull gray along the muzzle and shoulders, a weathered banner of survival rather than age. One ear stood alert, while the other bore a slight tear near the tip, a mark earned long before the snow claimed him. Around his neck, half hidden beneath matted fur, lay the faint circular scar of an old training collar, the kind used only on dogs that once served humans with purpose and command. His eyes were amber and intelligent, eyes that had once followed hand signals in silence and trusted voices without question. Now, those same eyes searched only for scent, for movement, for meaning in a world that had forgotten his name. Months ago, perhaps longer, he had been discarded near a logging road after a failed operation that left his handler injured and his unit disbanded. Loyalty, however, does not understand bureaucracy, and the bond he once carried had nowhere to go when the uniform disappeared. Since then, he had survived on instinct, on scraps stolen from behind closed buildings, on the mercy of distance, and on a quiet refusal to lie down and disappear. The snow had taken many things from him: warm ground, familiar commands, the comfort of belonging. But it had not taken his memory of what humans sounded like when they were afraid. Tonight, that memory returned on the wind. Beneath the layered scent of pine sap, frozen soil, and gasoline drifting through the forest, a thin, panicked rhythm pulsed through the storm like a wounded heartbeat. Metal, oil, fear. The dog lifted his head slowly, nostrils flaring as the scent carried again. Sharper now, closer, distinct from the wild signatures of deer and rabbit and fox. This was not prey. This was not threat. This was something trapped. He moved without sound, paws sinking deep into powder that would have swallowed weaker animals whole, his body staying low and fluid as branches groaned overhead beneath growing weight. The wind tore at his fur, packed snow against his face, blurred his vision into shifting white veils, yet the scent grew stronger with every careful step. A vehicle, half camouflaged by snow and shadow, emerged between trees like a wounded beast that had crawled here to die. Its lights were dark, its engine silent, but still warm. The dog circled wide at first, instincts old as his bones mapping angles, searching for sudden movement, listening for threat in the wind. Then he heard it. A sound so faint it barely existed above the storm, but clear enough to stop his heart mid-beat. A dull, irregular tapping from inside the metal shell, followed by a muffled breath that trembled with pain and restraint. He froze. Every muscle in his body tightened, not in fear but in recognition. That sound had a shape. It was the sound humans made when they had no voice left to use. The German shepherd approached the rear of the truck with slow, deliberate steps, tail low but steady, ears forward as the wind screamed around him. The back compartment was sealed beneath a heavy canvas cover, stiffened by ice, its edges frayed where the cold had already begun to claim it. From behind that barrier came another weak thud, then silence, then a shuddering inhale. He pressed his nose to the canvas, and the world suddenly sharpened. Sweat cooled by terror, blood faint beneath fabric, leather and snow, and the unmistakable human scent of grief layered with stubborn will. Inside the darkness, Claire Morgan was bound at the wrists, her circulation numbing as the truck bounced over hidden roots and frozen ruts, her breath fogging into nothing she could not see. At some distant edge of awareness, she sensed movement outside, nothing she could name, nothing she could fully believe, but instinct whispered that she was no longer entirely alone. The dog did not bark. Sound would bring danger. Sound would announce weakness. Instead, he shifted his weight and tested the canvas with his teeth, not tearing, not attacking, only learning. The fabric gave slightly beneath his grip, stiff and unyielding from cold, but not indestructible. He released it and stepped back again, eyes narrowing, head tilting just enough to study the distance between threat and opportunity. Footprints marked the ground near the cab, scattered, hurried. Human prints weighted with haste and fear rather than control. The storm was already softening their edges. Somewhere, not far, the men who had taken the woman were moving, arguing, afraid of what the weather might steal from them before they finished what they had begun. The dog understood only fragments of that danger, but fragments were enough. Once, long ago, his world had been built on commands and trust, on steel doors opening at a single signal, on running forward when every instinct screamed to hesitate. Those memories stirred now, like embers beneath snow. He remembered the shape of a handler's praise, the warmth of a palm on his head after a task well done, the certainty that his speed and teeth and intelligence were meant to stand between terror and the defenseless. That certainty rose again with quiet authority. He stepped back into the drifting white, circling the truck one last time before disappearing into the storm as silently as he had arrived. Inside the compartment, Claire strained against the zip ties until her fingers burned with numb fire, her breath ragged as the cold gnawed deeper with every minute. The truck had stopped moving now, its engine cut, the forest closing, in with the oppressive stillness that follows violence. In the darkness she listened, not for voices, not for footsteps, but for proof that time itself had not abandoned her. And just when she feared the storm had swallowed even sound, something brushed faintly against the metal wall near her shoulder, followed by the softest scrape, as if claws tested surface with delicate insistence. Her heart stuttered. Then, impossibly, she heard a low, controlled exhale, not human, not wind. A presence. Outside once more, the German shepherd lifted his head to the raging sky, snow streaking across his vision, and in his silence there was no hesitation, only purpose. Whatever fate had stripped from him in the past, this moment returned something vital to its rightful place. He turned away from the truck at last and began to run, muscles stretching into full stride as he cut through drifts that would have stalled lesser bodies, the storm howling approval or warning with equal ferocity as he aimed himself toward a distant cabin he remembered only by instinct and memory of warmth. Somewhere ahead, unseen, a man who had laid down his uniform years ago sat surrounded by ghosts and wood smoke, unaware that an answer to his own buried grief was already racing through the snow toward his door. The cabin stood at the edge of the timberline, like a forgotten confession, half buried in snow and shadow, its windows dim behind frost-scarred glass, its roof heavy with silent white weight that had been gathering for days. This was where Ethan Cole had chosen to disappear. At 41, he carried the body of a man who had once been built for motion and emergency, broad-shouldered and solid, with hands still strong enough to carry stretchers through fire and storm, yet now marked by a stillness that had nothing to do with peace. His dark hair had thinned slightly at the temples, streaked with premature gray that no one in his former rescue unit remembered from before the avalanche, and his face held the quiet erosion of grief rather than age, a square jaw set in habitual restraint, a mouth that rarely curved into anything resembling a smile, and eyes the color of overcast sky that seemed always fixed on something no one else could see. Once, Ethan had been known as the man who ran toward danger when others hesitated, a senior rescue specialist with mountain search and rescue, respected for his calm in chaos, feared by storms, trusted by those who knew what it meant to be pulled back from the edge of death by hands that refused to let go. That man had vanished the day the mountain took his son. The avalanche had come without warning during what was supposed to be a routine winter evacuation, a wall of white roar that erased the boy's small red jacket from the world in less than a heartbeat. They found the others. They never found Ethan's child. In the weeks that followed, neighbors spoke in hushed sympathy. Commanders offered leave, counselors extended hands heavy with practiced words, but none of it crossed the distance grief had carved inside him. He left the unit quietly, without ceremony, sold the house filled with echoes too loud to endure, and retreated to the cabin where sound itself seemed afraid to follow. Tonight, the storm returned with the same voice as the long-ago disaster. Wind howling through the pines with a force that made branches bow like penitent bodies, and snow striking the roof in steady, suffocating waves. Inside, the fire in the stone hearth burned low, its warmth confined to a narrow circle that barely reached Ethan's boots as he sat motionless in a wooden chair carved by his own hands years ago, staring into flame as if waiting for it to speak. He had not decorated for Christmas. The calendar on the wall still showed November, left there because turning the page felt like admitting that time was allowed to move forward without his son. On the small table beside him lay an old rescue radio, long dead of batteries, beside a faded photograph of a boy bundled in winter gear far too big for his frame, his grin reckless with life. Outside, the storm pressed closer, the world narrowing into wind and white and solitude. Then the knock came, not the gentle kind of knock made by neighbors bearing gifts and obligation, but a sudden, sharp disturbance at the door that did not wait for permission. Ethan did not move at first. For months after the avalanche, he had imagined his son's hand on that door so vividly he could feel the grain beneath small fingers. Eventually, the illusion had faded into something colder. The knock came again, harder this time, followed by a low, urgent sound that cut through wind like a thread pulled tight. A whine, the kind that trembles with need rather than fear. Ethan stood slowly, joints stiff from hours of stillness, and crossed the narrow cabin in long, careful steps, as if the storm might hear him and strike harder in response. When he opened the door, the night shoved its freezing breath into the room with violent insistence. Snow swirling inside like restless spirits, and in the wash of white stood the German shepherd. The dog was coated in ice and wind-driven snow, chest heaving, eyes bright with focus rather than panic. He looked neither wild nor tame in that moment, but something stranded between memory and survival. Ethan took him in with the quiet analysis of a man who had spent decades reading the language of bodies in crisis, the broad chest rising too fast for true exhaustion, the slight tremor of one hind leg from strain rather than injury, the torn ear that spoke of past conflict, the circular scar at the neck that told a story of discipline, not abandonment by birth, a former working dog, a survivor. The shepherd did not bark. He stepped forward once, then turned sharply and looked back into the storm, his movements deliberate, eyes locking briefly onto Ethan's with unmistakable intent. Then he returned and tugged the edge of Ethan's coat with controlled insistence, not frantic, not playful, but precise in the way rescue animals communicate when seconds matter. The gesture struck Ethan with a force far greater than the cold. It was a signal he had given and received 1,000 times in his former life. Follow me. Someone needs you. His first instinct was to step back. The reflex of withdrawal had become second nature over the years, a shield that kept the world from pulling him back into meaning when meaning felt too dangerous to touch. He shook his head once, not at the dog, but at the impossible suggestion forming in the space between them. No, he murmured, though his voice barely rose above the wind. The shepherd did not retreat. He released the coat only to move forward again, eyes steady, and tug once more, slightly firmer this time, then turned again toward the trees, tail low but moving, as if marking a living path through the storm. The wind howled between them. Snow streamed sideways like shattered glass. Ethan's chest tightened with a memory he had tried for years to suffocate, the sound of his son calling out from somewhere beyond sight, needing help that came too late. His hands curled at his sides, the right one flexing unconsciously with the phantom weight of rescue gear, long unused. He looked back over his shoulder at the cabin interior, the dying fire, the silent photograph, the heavy quiet he had mistaken for safety. Outside waited the storm, the unknown, the impossible return to a role he had sworn never to play again. The dog waited without impatience. In his amber eyes there was no judgment, only faith built into muscle and breath. Something in Ethan cracked, not loudly, not enough to break him open, but enough to allow motion to pass through the fracture. He stepped back inside long enough to pull the emergency jacket from its hook, the one he had not worn since the avalanche, its reflective strips dull with dust. He grabbed the satellite radio from a locked cabinet, fingers trembling as he checked the charge, then clipped a flashlight and a rescue harness at his belt without fully realizing he was doing it. When he turned back, the shepherd was already facing the storm, waiting. They moved into the night together. The cold closed around them instantly, searing lungs and skin alike. But Ethan did not slow. He fell into the old rhythm of controlled steps and measured breath, the storm filling his ears with roaring chaos that somehow felt less violent than the silence he had left behind. The dog led with absolute certainty, not by sight alone, but by scent and instinct and a conviction that the path existed because it must. Wind whipped Ethan's jacket like a living thing, snow clogged his eyelashes, and the forest swallowed distance until direction itself seemed an act of faith rather than navigation. Still, he followed. Somewhere far behind them, deep in the trees, Claire Morgan lay bound inside a metal coffin of snow and darkness, unaware that a man who had once turned his back on life was being summoned by a dog who refused to forget what it meant to serve. The forest no longer resembled a place. It had become a moving absence, a living labyrinth of white and shadow that shifted with every gust of wind. Snow erased the ground as soon as it was disturbed, swallowing footprints before they could become memory. The storm pressed from every direction at once, bending tall pines into arching silhouettes that groaned under invisible weight. Ethan moved through it with measured urgency, the beam of his flashlight carving pale tunnels through the chaos, while the German shepherd ran several lengths ahead with unwavering certainty, cutting a path not with sight alone, but with the invisible language of scent, instinct, and purpose. The dog's powerful body moved like a tide against the storm, muscles flexing beneath thick fur as he navigated fallen branches, hidden roots, and drifts that reached chest-high in places. His breath came in steady bursts, controlled, not panicked, as if every step were guided by a voice the wind could not silence. Ethan followed with a rescue worker's discipline rather than a runner's speed, conserving strength, testing each step before committing his weight, mind calculating slope, exposure, and distance even as his heart pounded with an urgency he had not allowed himself to feel in years. The storm was familiar to him in a terrible way. Its sound, its unpredictable violence, the way it erased orientation and convinced even experienced men that survival was an illusion rather than a skill. Yet tonight, something inside him pushed back against that old fear with quiet defiance. After nearly half an hour of relentless movement, the German shepherd slowed abruptly near a dense thicket of snow-choked undergrowth. He lowered his head, nostrils flaring, circling once, twice, then stopping with rigid stillness. Ethan lifted his light and swept it across the area, revealing nothing but tangled branches glazed in ice and a steep descent beyond that vanished into drifting white. He stepped closer, crouching low, his free hand touching the snow near the dog's paws. "What did you catch?" he murmured, not expecting an answer, but the shepherd's body language spoke clearly enough. Scent concentration, recent passage, heat fading into cold, tire tracks, barely visible now, ghosts beneath the surface. They had gone downhill. The path that followed was treacherous, a sloping descent that twisted between trees like a concealed staircase of ice. Ethan drove the tip of his boot into packed snow with each step, leaning forward into the grade, breath burning as cold pierced deep into his lungs. The shepherd descended first, shifting weight with controlled precision, occasionally looking back to confirm Ethan still followed. Halfway down, a sound broke through the storm that did not belong to wind or forest, an irregular scraping, faint but persistent. The German shepherd halted instantly, ears snapping forward. Ethan froze beside him, shutting off his flashlight for a heartbeat to listen with naked attention. The scraping came again, followed by a low, labored huff. Ethan swung the light across the trees and found movement to the left, a shape struggling in the snow near a fallen log. As they approached cautiously, the beam revealed an old husky mix, its coat once a proud silver white, now dull and matted with ice, one hind leg twisted at an unnatural angle and trembling with pain. The dog's muzzle was frosted with frozen breath, and its pale blue eyes held more exhaustion than fear. It did not growl or retreat when Ethan stepped close. It simply stood, swaying slightly, drawing shallow breaths as if each one cost more than it could afford. The German shepherd approached with slow diplomacy, lowering his head, touching noses briefly in silent understanding. This dog had survived more storms than mercy. Ethan knelt despite the cold biting through his pants, examining the injured leg with careful hands. The bone was not broken cleanly, but the joint was damaged badly enough to make movement a burning ordeal. The husky bore the examination without resistance, tongue lolling as it exhaled faint clouds into the night. "You should be dead out here," Ethan whispered, not with accusation but with something dangerously close to respect. He could not carry it, not with the path ahead still unknown, not with the storm thickening again. But when he pulled back, the husky took a tentative step forward, then another, positioning itself behind them at a slow, stubborn distance. It chose to follow. Ethan did not argue with instinct any longer. The forest deepened as they moved on, trees closing tighter together, as if conspiring to hide what lay ahead. The shepherd surged forward again with renewed intensity, his pace quickening, body angling against the wind as the scent grew stronger. After another long stretch of movement, Ethan felt the storm begin to thin, not in force, but in sound, as if something ahead absorbed it. Then he saw it, a faint, unsteady glow flickering between the trunks, so weak it might have been a reflection of his own light if it had not pulsed once, twice, and steadied into a dull, trembling presence. Truck lights, barely alive beneath layers of ice and branches. The shepherd stopped on the edge of a narrow clearing and crouched low, every muscle drawn tight with focused restraint. Ethan cut his flashlight again and slipped behind a wide tree, peering through the snow-veiled distance. The pickup truck sat angled awkwardly between two thick trunks, its tires half buried, its front end damaged from impact with frozen ground. The rear compartment was sealed beneath stiffened canvas. Two figures moved near the cab, their shapes distorted by snow and shadow, voices rising and falling in agitated bursts. Even without hearing the words clearly, Ethan understood the rhythm of panic, plans unraveling under pressure, men arguing not about what to do next, but about who would bear the cost when everything failed. The storm was destroying whatever timeline they had trusted. The husky stopped several paces behind Ethan and lay down slowly, conserving strength. The German shepherd shifted restlessly, nails biting into ice, energy brimming at the boundary between discipline and impulse. Ethan raised the satellite radio carefully and switched it on beneath his jacket to shield the sound from wind. The device flickered to life with quiet static. He adjusted the antenna by feel and spoke in low, steady tone born of hundreds of rescue calls. "This is Ethan Cole, former mountain search and rescue, transmitting SOS from grid sector north of Pine Hollow, deep forest descent, possible officer abducted, vehicle located, 2 suspects on scene, requesting immediate tactical and medical response." He paused, listening through the rush of interference. For a terrifying second, there was nothing. Then, faintly, a voice cut through like a thin wire stretched across chaos. "Signal. Repeat coordinates." Ethan transmitted again with more precision, heart beating heavy, but controlled as location data slipped into the void. The shepherd did not move. He watched the truck with absolute focus, memorizing movement, measuring threat. One of the men slammed a fist against the side of the cab, his voice rising into the storm in a sharp, furious arc, while the other paced in frantic steps, gesturing wildly as if the forest itself were an enemy conspiring against them. Inside the sealed compartment, unseen by all but scent and instinct, Claire Morgan lay bound in the darkness, her strength dwindling, consciousness drifting at the edges as cold gnawed deeper through clothing and bone. The shepherd lifted his head suddenly, ears pivoting toward the compartment, as if he had heard something only he could interpret. Ethan's grip tightened on the radio. They could not attack, not yet. 2 men with firearms in close quarters, 1 injured officer trapped inside, visibility collapsing with every passing second. To rush in blind would not be courage, but waste. His role now was not to strike, but to hold, to observe, to delay fate with patience rather than heroics. The husky raised its head weakly and released a faint, strangled sound that might once have been a howl, then lowered its muzzle again into the snow. Around them, the storm tightened its grip, howling through the clearing as if the mountain itself were breathing hard with anticipation. Somewhere beyond the white wall that separated this hidden place from the rest of the world, sirens had begun to stir, distant, unaware, but moving. And in the fragile space between stillness and violence, 3 wounded beings waited. A man with grief frozen deep in his bones, a shepherd who remembered what it meant to serve, and an old husky that had chosen to follow them, not because it believed in rescue, but because it refused to lie down and disappear in the snow. The storm no longer raged blindly. It hovered over the clearing like a living witness, wind circling trees with deliberate cruelty, as if the mountain itself leaned in to see what choice would be made in the dark. Snow fell thick and sideways, swallowing distance and bending light into dull halos around the dying truck lamps. Ethan stayed crouched behind the shelter of a split pine, every muscle locked in tension, breath restrained to shallow control as his eyes tracked the nervous, erratic movement of the 2 men near the cab. The German shepherd pressed low against the frozen ground beside him, body trembling not from fear, but from restraint. The leash of discipline holding back a lifetime of instinct that screamed a charge. Several long yards behind them, the old husky lay half buried in snow, chest rising unevenly as pain and cold fought for dominance, pale eyes never leaving the truck. Time stretched into something elastic and cruel, measured not in seconds, but in the slow drift of snowflakes and the rising pitch of human panic. One of the criminals, a tall man with a jagged scar along his cheekbone and hands that shook despite the gun he gripped, paced in tight circles near the driver's side. The other, broader and heavier, stood near the rear compartment, kicking at ice clinging to the bumper, as if violence against metal might quiet the fear gnawing at his chest. Their voices cut harshly through the wind in broken fragments, words lost, but intent unmistakable. The storm had trapped them, the truck was failing, and whatever they had hidden in the forest no longer mattered as much as escape. Inside the sealed compartment, Claire Morgan drifted in and out of a fevered half-consciousness, breath stuttering in painful bursts that froze in her lungs before she could exhale fully. Her wrists burned where the ties bit into numbed flesh, and her shoulders ached from hours of tension against steel that offered no comfort and no reply. Somewhere within the darkness pressed tight around her, a distant vibration traveled faintly through the wall, footsteps, movement, or only the illusion of hope shaping itself from desperation. Then it came again, clearer this time, the faint scraping of claws against metal, cautious, measured. Her eyes flew open in the darkness. The German shepherd moved with lethal silence now, body sliding through shadow and snow as if the storm had folded itself into his muscles. He circled the rear of the truck wide and low, avoiding the scattered footprints near the cab where the men lingered. Every step was placement, not motion. When he reached the rear canvas, he rose just enough to test it once more with his teeth. The fabric was stiffer now, frozen hard by accumulating ice, but it yielded slightly at the frayed seam. Inside, Claire felt the vibration through the wall at her back and sucked in a ragged breath that burned like glass. The man near the rear turned suddenly, alerted by something he could not quite identify. He moved closer, boots crunching on snow, as he raised his flashlight with a sharp, frantic sweep across the back of the vehicle. Ethan's heart slammed hard against his ribs as the beam skimmed inches from the hidden outline of the shepherd, pressed into shadow. For a breathless moment, everything balanced on nothing. Then fate tilted. The man reached for the latch of the rear compartment, muttering under his breath, as if to reassure himself, the prisoner still remained where fear had placed her. As his gloved hand closed around the frozen handle, the German shepherd struck. He launched upward in a surge of muscle and precision, jaws tearing into the weakened canvas seam with a ripping sound that sliced through wind and silence alike. Cold air exploded inward, rushing into the compartment like a living force, and with it came the raw, stabbing shock of freedom against Claire's skin. She gasped violently as fresh oxygen flooded lungs that had forgotten its taste, her body convulsing between pain and relief. The man stumbled back with a strangled curse, slipping in the churned snow as he fumbled for his weapon. "Dog!" he shouted, panic tearing control from his voice. The scarred man near the cab spun at the sound and yanked his gun free in one frantic, fluid motion, swinging the barrel toward the blur of movement at the rear. The German shepherd had already dropped back into shadow, poised to strike again, but waiting for the opening that mattered. The gun barked once. Sharp, explosive thunder, swallowed instantly by the storm. The shot went wild. From behind Ethan, the husky surged up with a defiance that defied its ruined leg, dragging its broken body forward through snow with a howl that was half pain, half fury, and entirely refusal. The sound tore through the clearing like a blade. Both men jerked toward it instinctively, the momentary shift of attention creating the fracture Ethan needed. He rose from cover and hurled a compact flare hard toward the far edge of the clearing, its sudden violent bloom of red light igniting the snow into a blinding storm of fire and shadow. "Police!" he shouted with the full force of his lungs, voice carried by wind and amplified by fear. "Weapons down!" The command was a lie born of necessity. Backup was not yet at their backs, and he knew it. But truth had no power in moments like this, only conviction. The flare hissed and burned, its light reflecting wildly off trunks and ice, transforming the forest into a hallucination of movement and threat. The scarred man fired again blindly into the glare, his shot carving empty snow as the other shouted incoherently, trapped between flight and fight with nowhere safe to choose. The German shepherd took that moment and closed the distance in a flash of black and gray, slamming into the broader man's side with enough force to knock him off balance and drive him backward into the snow. The man screamed as his grip on the weapon faltered, arms pinwheeling for purchase that did not exist. Ethan lunged forward then, not an attack, but an intervention, driving his shoulder into the man's chest to shove him farther from the fallen gun, boots skidding wildly as both bodies crashed into a drift. He did not strike. He grappled only long enough to buy time, to keep the threat occupied while the shepherd wheeled back toward the second man. The scarred man raised his weapon again with trembling hands, breath hitching in ragged bursts as panic devoured what discipline he once possessed. The husky hurled itself forward once more, collapsing into the snow directly in his path, with a sound that tore from its chest like the last defiance of a dying star. The man stumbled in shock and horror at the sudden broken body at his feet, just long enough for the storm to deliver what men could not. Sirens burst through the white wall beyond the trees, first distant, then multiplied, then unbearably close. Red and blue light slashed through the forest in violent, rhythmic pulses, cutting order into chaos with relentless authority. Voices followed, clear, sharp commands layered over one another as shadowed figures surged into the clearing from 3 directions at once. The scarred man dropped his weapon as if it burned him. The other stopped struggling beneath Ethan's weight as hands seized him from behind and forced his arms into submission. Within seconds that felt like lifetimes, both criminals were face down in the snow, wrists bound in steel where fear had bound Claire not long before. The German shepherd stood between the fallen men and the truck now, chest heaving, eyes bright and unblinking, a living wall of purpose as officers swept past him toward the rear compartment. The canvas, torn and flapping in the wind, gaped open like a wound. Claire blinked against the sudden explosion of light as figures moved in front of her, voices layered with urgency and disbelief. Hands cut the restraints from her wrists with swift precision, and when the last tie fell away, sensation roared back into her arms in a wave of unbearable pain that dropped a cry from her lips before she could stop it. She slid forward weakly, and strong arms caught her before the snow could. The German shepherd stepped forward then, lowering his head as if offering the space of his presence rather than his body. Claire's gaze found him through tears that froze on her lashes almost as soon as they formed. The storm swirled around them, sirens painting the snow in violent color, and for the first time since the night her husband died, the wall inside her shattered completely. She sobbed without restraint, grief and terror and gratitude pouring out in a flood that left her shaking and breathless. Ethan stood several paces away beneath the flare's dying glow, chest heaving, hands numb with cold and relief alike. The husky lay in the snow where it had fallen, officers already moving to lift it with careful hands and blankets. The mountain did not speak, it did not judge. It only watched as the living reclaimed one another from the edge. The storm loosened its grip on Pine Hollow just before dawn, as if the mountain itself had finally exhaled. Snow still lay deep across rooftops and roads, softening every sharp edge the night had carved, but the wind had quieted into something gentler, almost respectful. The town awakened slowly beneath a pale winter sun that turned every drift into silver and every frozen branch into glass. By mid-morning, news of the rescue had spread through the narrow streets with the speed only small towns can produce, carried not by headlines, but by whispered relief and trembling gratitude. At Pine Hollow Memorial Hospital, the corridors that usually echoed with routine footsteps now carried the subdued hum of vigil and hope. Claire Morgan lay in a private recovery room at the end of the hall, wrapped in thermal blankets, IV line steady at her arm, her dark hair loosened from its rigid duty-bound order and spilling across the pillow in soft disarray. Without the uniform, without the stiffness of command, she looked younger than her 32 years, her sharp gray eyes dulled by exhaustion, but still alive with awareness. The doctors said exposure had pushed her dangerously close to hypothermia, that another hour inside the frozen compartment might have stolen her breath for good. But she had survived. Survival, for the first time in years, felt heavier than gratitude. Sarah Whitman stood at the foot of her bed, hands clasped tightly together as if afraid to let the moment slip away. The dispatcher's round face was pale with days of fear, released all at once, her eyes rimmed red but shining. "You scared the whole town," she said softly, attempting a smile that trembled. Claire met her gaze and felt something long, locked inside her, loosen. "I didn't mean to," she answered, her voice hoarse but real. And in that quiet exchange, the distance that grief had built between her and the world thinned just enough for warmth to pass through. Down the hall, officers moved in and out with murmured respect, their presence protective without being suffocating. The 2 men responsible now sat in separate interrogation rooms beneath harsh fluorescent light, their network of illegal forest operations unraveling rapidly as evidence surfaced from hidden storage sites deeper in the mountains. What had once been rumor and shadow was now paper and proof. Pine Hollow, a town long haunted by unexplained disappearances of goods and animals along its forest edges, finally had its answers. but the town spoke far less about the criminals than it did about the dog. At the Regional Training and Rehabilitation Center outside Pine Hollow, the German Shepherd lay on a padded mat beneath warmth lamps, his breathing slow and even, a light sedative easing the strain that still trembled faintly through his muscles. Veterinarian staff moved quietly around him, hands practiced and gentle as they examined old scars, tested reflexes, and spoke in calm voices that no longer carried urgency. His name, discovered through a fading microchip registry, had once been Ranger, though the years between had stripped the word of daily meaning. Under the clinical lights, his amber eyes followed every movement with quiet intelligence, neither fearful nor aggressive, as if accepting this strange return to order with patient curiosity. The trainers spoke of rehabilitation not as a question, but as a process already unfolding. His responses were precise, controlled, unmistakably professional. Within weeks, it became clear that he had not forgotten his purpose. He had only been waiting for the world to remember it too. Claire visited him for the first time 3 days after her rescue, moving slowly down the long corridor with Sarah at her side for support. When Ranger lifted his head and saw her through the glass partition, his ears pricked forward, body stirring with recognition, not rooted in command, but in connection. When they were finally allowed into the enclosure, he did not leap or bark. He rose, walked toward her, and sat in perfect stillness at her feet. Claire knelt despite the protest of healing muscles and rested her hand on his broad head, tears filling her eyes without warning. "You came back for me," she whispered. The words were not for him alone. They were for the part of herself that had stopped believing anyone ever would. In the mountains beyond town, Ethan Cole stood once more beneath the open sky in his rescue uniform, the familiar weight of purpose settling across his shoulders with an ache both painful and welcome. He had returned to the search and rescue unit quietly, not with fanfare, but with the simple statement that he was ready to work again. The commanders had not asked why. They had only nodded, understanding that some questions are answered only by action. On his first official callback, he moved with the same calm precision that once defined him, but now there was something new beneath the surface, an acceptance of loss that no longer demanded isolation. At night, the cabin still stood where it always had, but its silence no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like rest. The old husky, whose name no one had ever known, became something of a legend in Pine Hollow. Too frail for long rehabilitation programs and too stubborn for rescue shelters, the town decided together that he belonged to everyone. A rotating schedule of care was arranged without paperwork or argument. Children brought him soft blankets. Elders offered warm porridge and quiet company. He spent his days near the general store's wood stove, rising slowly when someone new approached, tail sweeping weakly but with unmistakable dignity. He had followed a rescue not because he expected salvation, but because he refused to surrender to disappearance. Now, without understanding why, he was no longer alone. Christmas Eve returned to Pine Hollow, not with the violence of storm, but with the calm authority of survival earned. The town, square, once buried in dark, bloomed with light as residents gathered beneath the great evergreen that had stood there longer than any of them could remember. Strings of warm gold lights wrapped the branches like woven constellations, and ornaments crafted by children over generations shimmered beside fresh snowfall. Claire stood among them, with her arm in a temporary sling, and Ranger seated proudly at her side, his dark coat glossy beneath the glow. Sarah hovered nearby, pretending to supervise logistics while doing nothing but watch her friend breathe in the moment. Ethan arrived quietly at the edge of the square, uniform beneath a heavy winter coat. His presence noticed not through announcement, but through recognition. When his eyes met Claire's across the gathering crowd, something unspoken passed between them. Not romance, not promise, but mutual acknowledgement of the thin line between ending and beginning they had both crossed. The mayor spoke briefly, voice thick with emotion rather than ceremony, thanking those who had stood between the storm and the helpless. Children sang carols slightly off-key. Laughter rose into the cold like living heat. Snow drifted gently now, no longer a threat, but a blessing laid softly across shoulders and rooftops. As the tree lights brightened and the final carol faded into quiet, Claire felt something she had not allowed herself to feel since Daniel's death. Peace not born from forgetting, but from surviving what could not be undone. She knelt beside Ranger and rested her forehead briefly against his neck. the warmth of his living presence anchoring her to the now. "We're still here," she whispered. And for the first time, the words did not hurt. Around them, the town of Pine Hollow stood together in shared breath. Not because they had escaped loss, but because they had chosen not to let loss define the rest of their lives. The storm had tried to erase them. Instead, it had returned them to one another. Sometimes God's greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder or fire from the sky. They arrive quietly through a loyal dog that refuses to abandon a stranger, through a broken man who dares to stand again after losing everything, and through a wounded heart that learns how to trust life once more. In our daily lives, we all face winters of the soul, moments of fear, loneliness, grief, and exhaustion when it feels easier to hide than to hope. But God never leaves us alone in the storm. He sends help in ways we do not expect and through people and moments we never planned. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need strength today. Leave a comment and tell us what this story made you feel. And if you believe in the quiet miracles that God still sends into our lives, please type Amen in the comments. May God bless you and your loved ones with peace, protection, and healing in every season of life. And please remember to press subscribe to support this YouTube channel so we can continue bringing you stories of faith, hope, and redemption to the world. Thank you for walking this journey with us.